Hi everyone, my name is Maor. I'm a security researcher at Illusive. I'm very excited to be here today. My presentation called The Needle in the Needlestack, Discovering Identity Risks. We're going to talk a lot about identities. We're going to talk about what they are, how to protect them, how to protect our organizations from them, what are the risks that they pose on us. We'll see some attacks on identities and hopefully some solutions for you guys to take back home. So let's begin. So a quick brief on the agenda. We're going to talk about ITDR, what it is, path of movements of identities, challenges in protecting identities and identity systems. We're going to talk about shadow administration, what it is, the threats that shadow admins pose on our organizations. We're going to look at some examples, and you can maybe do a little checkup about your organizations. And we're going to talk about the Uber attack that happened about a month ago. Then we'll have time for some questions. So, who am I? My name is Maor, as I mentioned. I'm located in Israel, in Tel Aviv. I have about 8 years of experience in the cybersecurity area. I started at the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. I was a pen tester back there, did it for a couple of years, and now for the past 2 years, I'm a security researcher. About Illusive, not trying to promote, but we are built by attackers to stop attackers. Illusive takes the one thing that attacker needs, which is access to privileged identities. By doing this, we're able to give security teams the ability to have a great visibility about what happens in their networks, and we also help them discover and remediate privileged identity threats and vulnerabilities. Something extra about Illusive, we're going to talk about it later in the presentation and see what it has to do with identities, but we plant deceptions as well as fail-safes in our customers' networks. In order to explain what it is, let's just do a quick role play. Let's say that you are bank robbers and you're targeting a very valuable bank, a very big bank, and you plant your rob, and the date of the rob has arrived, and you break into their safe room. But instead of just finding one safe, you find 100 safes. Some of the safes might be open, some of them might be closed. They might have fake money in it or trackable money. And we do the same thing, but our currency is privileged identities credentials. We plant stored credentials and RDP session and SSH keys and password files, a lot of things for attackers to use and for us to know once they're using it. So this is going to be the motto that's going to, I think this whole presentation is going to go around. Identity is the new perimeter, but it's also the new vulnerability. We live in an era where everything is identities. Our networks just keeps on growing. We want them to keep on growing. We have constantly new employees joining in, new features that we put into our programs, we have new customers, and all of this comes with an increasement of identities, which is a good thing, but also can be a very tough job to handle. Now, as I said, identities are extremely targeted by attackers, and credential misuse is one of the most primary attack vectors nowadays. But when it comes to managing identities, we already have a solution for that. It's called IAM, Identities Access Management. Now, ITDR is a term invented by Gartner to protect identities and identities systems, because most of the work in improving IAM capabilities and protecting IAM was actually focused on protecting the user authentication process, which in turn just increasing the attack surface that attackers can have. And ITDR came as a solution to that. It's a collection of tools and best practices to defend identity systems. Now, let's refer to the awesome meme that I made. ITDR is here to solve not only single platform identities. We have an on-premise identities and we have cloud identities, but the risk is much more than that. This is a scenario in which the whole is greater than its parts, because we need to secure hybrid identities as well. And ITDR really helps us do that. Now, this slide is supposed to picture us the cybersecurity space. It's a space that has a lot of different identities. It has users and groups and computers. It has Okta systems, subscription tenants, a lot of different identities. Each and every one has a different set of characteristics. And our mission is to look at this cybersecurity space of identities, but to correlate each identity to an action. Action is basically the power of each identity. And they can be used or owned by an identity to make a certain action happen. If manipulated, by the way, these actions can bring an identity to escalate privileges or to move laterally across the network to collect sensitive data, and there's a lot that attackers can do manipulating these actions of those identities. Now, I'm going to divide it into three categories: the on-premise, the cloud, and the system identities. Each and every one of them is behaving differently and can do different actions. Now, as I said before, any identity can have or do a specific action. In this example, a user can authenticate to a resource. A user can also have ACLs, a set of permission over different objects. And I'm guessing that you can already see where this is going. We have a lot of different possibilities for every identity. No matter if it's a cloud identity or an on-premise identity, we have a big set of permutations between these identities and actions, which makes it very hard to keep track on everything. It just creates a lot of noise in our networks, noise that expresses in multiple authentication attempts and logs and data traveling from one server to the other. And this is also another case in which the whole is greater than its parts, because right here we see a single identities that can perform certain actions. But let's not forget, identities don't live alone. They can move from one another in what we call an identity path. For example, a user can, we have a blue line drawn from a user to a computer to MMD and then a subscription. Now, without any context, we have no idea if it's a legitimate path or not. So let's say that this is a normal behavior. We have an on-premise user authenticated to its computer. From there, he can access an MMD, which has a role assignment on the subscription. Now, if you want to draw a different scenario, we have a compromised user logged into a computer. From there, he can find stored credentials to an MMD, which has misconfigured role access on the subscription. Let's say it has an owner role. Now, just like we saw with the red lines, there are multiple lines in here as well. I mean, identities move along and travel between one another all the time, which makes it a very difficult job to identify which of these blue lines are normal and which are not. Now, we can't cover it all, and we won't cover it all because it's endless. We keep on adding new identities to our networks, which only makes finding this troubled path even harder, which is literally finding a needle in a needle stack. So one of the paths is drawn in yellow, and this will be an escalation route. I mean, that's a route that allows a single identity to gain privileged in a way that it's not meant to. And our challenge is to isolate these exploitable routes between all existing ones. So right now we have a path drawn from a user to a policy to Okta, and then PAM and EDR. Now, if this route rings any bell, then congratulations, you are well familiar with recent cyber attack, because this is a very similar scenario to the Uber one that I'm going to explain in much detail in the few next slides. But right here, there's only a one yellow line, but let's not forget there can be 1, 2, or 100, which brings us back to the same problem of finding a needle in a needle stack. How can we isolate these exploitable routes from all the existing ones? Now, in order to answer that, we're going to have to ask ourselves some questions. The first question will be, how can an attacker get to this point? We can identify a specific identity and see what does it take from an attacker perspective to get to here. Once we've answered that, the next question is going to be, what can an attacker accomplish from this point? And once we have this answer, we'll be able to tell whether if it's a normal behavior or not. Once we have the answers to these questions, we're able to clear out the noise. We've mapped the exploitable routes, and now we can really focus on them. Now, I want to propose a different approach to looking at this cybersecurity space. We can look at every identity as an asset by itself, but we can also look at every identity as the next step in the attack. For an example, if we take Okta, some attackers might consider Okta to be the end goal of their attack. They want to go to Okta, and for them, this will be the success of this attack. But others might leverage Okta just as a pivot, and they'll use it to get to their target. Now, when we look at this route, we're not trying to find the direct privileged access to resources, but we want to take into account the detour as well. We want to examine all the different paths in which an attacker can gain access, not in the explicit way. Now, we call this behavior shadow administration. So what is shadow administration? Shadow administration is your typical shadow IT as most of us know it, but with a twist. Shadow admins is identities that are privileged outside of best practices and aren't easily visible to IT or security teams. So why not just shadow IT? Because when we look at all of these passable exploitable routes, there are many combinations and many different approaches to what considered to be a privileged identity. Let's say an identity that can reset other identities' password. We know that it's very privileged. An identity that can change policies in the network, such as GPO or maybe configurations of security systems. That's also a very powerful identity. An identity that has permissive API permissions over different applications. That's also a very very privileged identity. So we want to make sure that we get all of these routes, we want to take the detours as well, not just the direct access to privileged identities. Now, I'll tell you an example for one of our clients. One of our clients, it's a big pharmacy company, which has a level 1 help desk, which is responsible for password resets. Now, they also have a level 3 help desk, which is responsible of managing all of their domain admin activity. They can change the members of the group, they can add a new domain admin, and this separation is considered to be great. We don't want to give one specific identity the power to do both. But we found on their network that a misconfiguration has led to level 1 help desk to gain the permissions of a level 3 help desk as well, which means that a single identity can reset other identities' password and add this identity to domain admins. Now, I bet most of you are thinking, this is not going to happen at my network. We have a very, we know, we are familiar with the identities in our networks. We know how to handle them right, how to treat them. But if I'm being honest, it exists on many organizations. How many? 100% of every organization we have ever encountered has at least one shadow admin opportunity. And when we think about it, it's impossible not to have shadow admin threats in our networks. Our networks are not sterilized. We manage so many identities that it's, we have to have these paths in our networks. So for some statistics, we found that 30% of shadow admin risks are exploitable in only a single step, which means what separates an attacker from exploiting an exploitable routes in our networks, what stops him is just one step, one action that he can take to make, to gain higher privileges in our organizations. And luckily for me, my job is to find these paths as they continue on growing, and we keep on finding new paths, because new systems just keeps on coming into our networks, and changes in configurations of our operating systems just keeps on happening. When Windows 11 just launched and a new distribution of Linux and Red Hat came, this only makes our platform, attack platform, bigger. Let's see some examples of these shadow admin threats. So we are on our beloved and protected on-premise environment, and we have two servers. We have web@mynet.com, which is a web server, and we have desktop, which is win@mynet.com. And we have configured an unconstrained delegation between. A word about unconstrained delegation. It's a configuration that we can apply on computers in our organization to store in memory the TGT of user account or machine account to act on the behalf of them. Once again, I'm not assuming that we all do this in our networks. This is considered a known bad. to have unconstrained delegation. But sometimes, the course of actions really demand us to do this. We run application that requires us to have security problematic configurations, and sometimes it's needed. So the naive approach will be, cool, I know I have two problematic identities, and I need to protect these two identities. So I'm going to monitor Win at my net and Web at my net. I'm going to search for specific traffic maybe between those two stations. But with shadow admins threats, I offer a better way to protect these by saying there's a lot of detours that an attacker can do in order to come to this identity and exploit it. Let's say that a certain computer on the network has a stored RDP session to Win at my net, or a user that can register a new machine into the network, which is a default way, a default configuration on our on-premise environment, unless changed, in which every single domain member can register up to 10 new machines into the domain. When doing so, the user becomes the owner of the machine, which gives him a very big set of permissive actions to do so. Now, Win at my net can also be attacked by a Kerberoasting attack. Let's say that the ticket that the SPN of winatmynet.com is used with RC4, which can be easily cracked. And maybe it's possible that another computer in the network has delegation to this computer. Now, these are all examples, but they're here to just to show us that there's a lot of detours that attackers can do in order to fulfill some attacks. Now, searching these shadow admin threats manually can be very difficult. We see here only an attack of 2 steps, but let's not forget there can be a lot more path leading to every single identity, which makes it very hard to get all the possible combinations and routes. Now, if we look at the next example, we've moved to our Azure platform, in which we have a web application that have an RBAC assignment on the subscription itself. RBAC assignment is a fine-grained access management of resource. Basically, it's a permission that gives a certain identity, a certain control on the subscription to manage resources and users and tenants. And here as well, we can monitor these two identities separately and see every single access to this web application. Or we can go back further in our path and say, okay, who has permission on this web application? And we might find a different application that has application read-write all permission that grants this application the ability to add or update secrets to this application. And we can keep on going back and say, who's the owner of this web application? The owner of this web application can eventually manipulate all the different identities in this route to get to the subscription. Now, funnily or sadly, Azure has nearly 10 different set of permissions that can grant an attacker the option to do a password manipulation. Now, it might be a password manipulation on a different application. It might be a password manipulation on a user, but there's a lot of different paths that attackers can take in order to gain control and to fulfill their attack. Now, we talked about identities. We talked about the actions that they can do. we talked about shadow administrations, and let's talk about how to begin resolving it or manage identities. We handle identities with the divide and conquer kind of method, and we separate it into 3 dimensions. The first dimension is the unmanaged identities. These are identities that the organization is failing to manage. It can express in identities that has outdated passwords, maybe temp admin accounts that live in our networks, and that's one of the most popular examples of problems in identities. Another example here about one of our customers, it's a big financial company that when we examined their network, we found that they are managing 400 local admin accounts in the labs. That sounds good. I mean, we saw that number and we were like, that's very impressive. We usually see a lot lower numbers. But when we completed our test, we found out that they are not managing 500 different local admin accounts. So unmanaged accounts can pose a very big threat on our organization, and they are very more likely to be attacked. Now, the next classification that we offer is the misconfigured identities. Misconfigured identities is all the shadow admins that we saw previously. These are identities that got their privileged access by a mistake. Some misconfiguration has happened that led them to be way privileged that they are supposed to be. And that is one of the biggest risks on organizations while an attack is happening. Adding some more statistics, 13% of shadow administrators have domain admin privileges. Now, your company might not be in those 13%, but still it has a lot impact, a very big impact on that, on our organizations. And another one, maybe I think that the biggest maybe the biggest and the most scariest permission that a shadow admin can have is DC sync. And we found that DC sync is 2% of all shadow administrators. And the final level of classification will be the exposed identities. Exposed identities are identities that has their privileged credentials stored somewhere on the machine. It can be by cached credentials. It can be stored credentials in application or OS password stores. It can be by disconnected RDP sessions or RDP file, passwords and password stores on shares and scripts. And these kind of identities is equivalent to leaving a sticky note with creds on your laptop. It's basically leaving an attacker the ability to manipulate credentials stored on an endpoint without a major effort. Now, this is maybe the most common risk that we encountered, but luckily for us, it's also the easiest to remediate. All you got to do is just erase the credentials. Now, it's important to us to understand that these classifications, they here to aid us cope with identities risks. It's not a yes or no question whether we are exposed to this risk or not, because we are. It's inevitable. The number of identities just keeps on growing and our company keeps on growing. So we are having identities risk right now, and by separating them into the unmanaged, misconfigured, and exposed categories, we can better protect and mitigate our threats. Now, another very important thing to remember here is identities or identity risks should be constantly and continuously searched. We are an expert in searching vulnerable code or vulnerable applications, but when it comes to vulnerable identities, we tend to do red team assessment once a year, find and mitigate these threats, and just move on. While this identities classification should be a continuous quest and journey. So now we're going to examine this approach on the latest Uber attack. We're going to see the risk that went on the Uber attack, and we're going to divide the different identities into categories. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Uber attack, Uber, the ride-sharing company, was attacked about a month ago. The person that is responsible for the attack is an 18-year-old hacker, possibly connected to the Lapsus group. And every single piece of information that we know about this attack actually came from Twitter. The attacker was on constant messaging with some security blogs on Twitter. And it started by a Slack message on Uber networks, on Uber Slack, that said, hey, I announce I'm a hacker and Uber has suffered from a data breach. This obviously caused a lot of panic on Ubers, but the first step of this attack was the attacker sent a specific user on Uber a lot of MFA requests to validate its login. It's currently unknown if he used credentials from previous leaks. I mean, the first breach to this user, the first authentication attempt, whether if it was a phishing attack or did he already knew his credentials. And he kept on sending these MFA requests for over an hour. The really brave user didn't approve it until he sent it another phishing SMS saying that he is an IT expert from Uber and he really needs him to approve this sign-in, like all IT employees do. The user clicked and approved this login attempt, and the attacker was able to infiltrate their network. The next step in here was this attacker actually started to map assets in Uber networks. He made some reconnaissance and he found a file server with access to it. I mean, the file server was open to anyone and he could go to this file server. On the next step, he started enumerating files and scripts on the file server. This is 101 of attack. Like we used to see this pattern years ago. It's considered to be very old-fashioned, but it turns out that it's still working because he found their hard-coded credentials to Thycotic, which is a PAM solution. Actually the user that managed Thycotic, and he also found their domain admin credentials, which basically gave him the ability to do whatever he wanted to do. Once got to the Thycotic, he really started to play. He entered almost every possible system that Uber has, rather if it's their vSphere managing virtual machines, one login responsible for SSO and authentication provider, Okta, Slack, AWS. He got access to pretty much everything, and the surprising thing that he didn't cause a lot of damage. Like he didn't do anything. He was capable of doing a very big destructive actions on Uber, and he didn't. Another fun thing that he found was he found a bug hunt platform that Uber manage, where users can report to Uber about bugs that they find, and he found it. So he currently has an unlimited bugs in Uber to be manipulated and exploited in the future. And that when we're looking at this attack, the obvious thing is to start saying, okay, I know what I am capable of doing better, but if we take these identities and we start really looking at how to protect them better and how to mitigate every one of them, I chose here 4 of the critical identities. We'll start by dividing each and every one of them to its specific classification. I'm going to start with Okta. So Okta, I chose it to be a misconfigured because first of all, we want to make sure that an SSO and authentication provider doesn't allow a user to send constantly MFA approvals to a specific user, which is a first thing to be remediated. It failed to do a max number of fails login attempt, and they didn't had a phishing-resistant authentication process. This psychotic is exposed because it had stored credentials to the user managing the psychotic on the file server. The authentication to psychotic, which is basically the most privileged identity in this network, the one that holds all the credentials and access to every powerful resource in the network. It has a single-factor password-based authentication mechanism. No approvals were needed for privileged sessions. The file server itself was also misconfigured, allowing every user in the domain, every authenticated domain member, to go to browse actually any file and every script, and it also had hard-coded credentials inside scripts, and the user itself that was it was a user that the password of the account was an old expired password that was easily to crack or didn't change for the past couple of years from previous leaks. And it could register as machines into the domain, which allows the user to perform a lot of different options and things inside their network. Now, classifying these identities really makes this solution easier, because now we know how to treat every single one of these identities and how to remediate them. So when we're talking about making it actionable, the first thing is to protect identity system as much as we protect the identities themselves. Identity systems are a very critical asset in our networks, and they should be treated as well. The second thing is find and remediate shadow admin threats, and this should be continuously, not as a one-time thing. And the third is we need to search for attack paths, not points. We need to take into account that an attack can always go back further with detours and access to different identities that will eventually help me fulfill my, my purpose in this attack. questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Bar.
Thank you.